Sarah Mitchell's screams echoed through the empty farmhouse as flames licked at her face, the smell of burning flesh mixing with the acrid smoke from the overturned kerosene lamp. Her stepson Tyler stood frozen in the doorway, his eyes wide with horror at what his rage had unleashed, while outside, a silent figure on horseback had witnessed everything through the kitchen window. The quiet rancher Jake Thompson had been riding past the Bennett property when he saw the flash of fire through the glass. But what he witnessed next would shatter the peaceful facade of Cedar Falls forever and force him to make a choice that would change 3 lives in ways none of them could imagine. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. The morning started like any other Tuesday in Cedar Falls, Montana, with Sarah Mitchell brewing coffee in the kitchen of the 2-story farmhouse on Maple Street, while frost clung to the windows like delicate lace. She moved quietly, her nurse's training having taught her to minimize noise during the early hours, especially with Tyler still asleep upstairs. The 19-year-old had been coming home later and later these past few weeks, reeking of alcohol and anger, slamming doors and muttering threats under his breath that made her skin crawl. Robert had already left for his shift at Riverside Lumber Mill, kissing her forehead absently while reassuring her that Tyler would come around eventually, that grief manifested differently in everyone, and that patience was all they needed. Sarah had been patient for 3 years now, ever since she'd married Robert Bennett and moved to this small Montana town where everyone knew everyone else's business but pretended not to see the growing tension in the Bennett household. She'd tried everything to connect with Tyler, from cooking his favorite meals to helping with homework he never bothered to complete, from gentle conversations about his mother to simply giving him space to grieve. Nothing worked. If anything, his hostility had intensified over the months, manifesting in cruel comments about her appearance, deliberate destruction of her belongings, and increasingly aggressive behavior that left her walking on eggshells in her own home. The coffee maker gurgled to life as she pulled her robe tighter around her shoulders, the Montana cold seeping through the old farmhouse walls despite the furnace running constantly. She'd grown to love this place despite everything. The way the morning light filtered through the pine trees, the sound of Miller's Creek babbling in the distance, the sense of community that came with small-town life. Her job at Cedar Falls Medical Clinic had introduced her to dozens of families, and she'd slowly built friendships with women like Mary Patterson, her co-worker who always had a kind word and fresh-baked cookies to share during their lunch breaks. The floorboards creaked overhead, signaling Tyler's awakening, and Sarah's stomach tightened with familiar dread. She'd learned to read the rhythm of his footsteps, the way his mood could be gauged by how heavily his boots hit the stairs. Today, the sound was particularly aggressive, each step like a drumbeat of impending confrontation. She busied herself preparing breakfast, scrambled eggs and toast, hoping that food might soften whatever storm was building in the teenager's mind. Tyler appeared in the doorway wearing yesterday's clothes, his dark hair disheveled and his eyes bloodshot from another night of drinking behind the abandoned grain elevator with his few remaining friends who hadn't grown tired of his increasingly volatile behavior. He was tall like his father, but lean in a way that suggested too many missed meals and too much alcohol, his face bearing the sharp angles of someone who'd lost weight from stress and poor choices. Sarah had watched him transform from a confused, grieving boy into this hostile stranger, and it broke her heart more than his cruelty ever could. "Good morning," she said softly, not turning from the stove where eggs sizzled in the cast-iron pan. "I made your favorite breakfast." Tyler snorted derisively, moving to the refrigerator and pulling out a carton of orange juice, drinking directly from it, despite her repeated requests that he use a glass. She chose not to comment, having learned that every correction, no matter how gentle, became ammunition for his verbal attacks. "My favorite breakfast was what my real mother used to make," he said, his voice dripping with venom. But I guess we can't all be perfect like Saint Sarah, can we? His words hit their intended target, but she kept her shoulders straight, refusing to give him the reaction he craved. She'd learned from Dr. Rodriguez during one of their brief conversations at the clinic that engaging with his provocations only escalated the situation, that teenagers often acted out when they felt powerless in other areas of their lives. "I know you miss her," Sarah replied quietly, plating the eggs with steady hands. "Your father talks about her often, how much she loved you, how proud she would be of the man you're becoming." It was the wrong thing to say, she realized immediately, watching Tyler's face contort with rage as he slammed the juice carton onto the counter with enough force to make the dishes rattle. "Don't you dare talk about my mother," he snarled, stepping closer to where she stood at the stove. "You don't know anything about her, about us, about what this family was like before you came along with your fake smiles and your pathetic attempts to replace her." Sarah felt her heart racing as he invaded her space, his breath sour with alcohol and sleep, his eyes blazing with a fury that seemed disproportionate to her gentle comment. She turned to face him, trying to project calm despite the fear crawling up her spine like ice water. "Tyler, I never tried to replace your mother." Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. "I know how much you loved her, how much you still love her. I just hoped we could find a way to be a family together, to honor her memory while building something new." Her words were measured, professional, the same tone she used with agitated patience at the clinic, but Tyler wasn't interested in de-escalation. "A family?" He laughed harshly. "You think this is a family? You're nothing but a gold-digging nurse who saw a lonely widower and moved in for the kill. My dad was so desperate for companionship that he couldn't see what everyone else in town knows, that you're just using him for his money and his house and his name." The accusation stung because it was so unfair, so far from the truth of her genuine love for Robert and her sincere desire to help Tyler heal from his grief. Outside, Jake Thompson guided his horse along the familiar path that skirted the Bennett property, his morning ride having become a ritual since his wife Catherine had died 2 years ago in a car accident on the icy mountain road leading to town. The routine helped him process the silence that had settled over his ranch like a heavy blanket, the way grief had transformed his comfortable solitude into something that felt more like isolation. He noticed everything during these rides, the way the light changed with the seasons, the migration patterns of birds, the subtle signs that indicated weather changes or problems with livestock. This morning something felt different as he approached the farmhouse where warm light glowed through the kitchen windows. Jake had known the Bennett family peripherally for years, had attended Robert's first wife's funeral, and nodded politely to Sarah during their few encounters at the hardware store or post office. He respected Robert's work ethic and had heard good things about Sarah's nursing skills from Frank Morrison, who seemed to know everyone's business whether they wanted him to or not. The horse snorted softly as they paused near the fence line, and Jake's attention was drawn to the kitchen window, where he could see 2 figures in what appeared to be an intense conversation. His instinct was to continue riding, to respect the privacy of neighbors, but something about the body language visible through the glass made him hesitate. The woman, Sarah, appeared to be backing away from the young man, her posture defensive, in a way that triggered alarm bells in Jake's mind. Back inside the kitchen, Tyler's anger had escalated beyond words into physical intimidation, and Sarah found herself pressed against the counter with nowhere to retreat as he loomed over her. His face twisted with years of accumulated grief and resentment. "You want to know what I think about you?" he said, his voice low and menacing. "I think you're a parasite. I think you saw a weak man destroyed by losing his wife, and you moved in like a vulture. I think my mother is rolling in her grave, knowing that some stranger is sleeping in her bed, cooking in her kitchen, pretending to care about her son. "Tyler, please," Sarah whispered, her hands gripping the counter behind her as she tried to maintain some distance between them. "I know you're hurting, but this isn't the way to handle it. We can talk to someone together, maybe Pastor Walsh or the counselor at school. There are people who want to help you work through these feelings." Her training kicked in even in her fear, her genuine desire to help this troubled young man overcome his pain. But Tyler interpreted her professional calm as condescension. "Help me?" he screamed, his voice cracking with emotion. "You want to help me? Then get out of my house. Get out of my life. Get out of my family." He grabbed the kerosene lamp from the counter, the one Robert's grandmother had used for decades during power outages, its brass base heavy in his hands as he raised it above, his head like a weapon. Sarah's eyes widened with genuine terror as she realized how far beyond reason he'd traveled, how the grief and anger had transformed him into someone capable of real violence. "Tyler, put that down," she said firmly, her nurse's training taking over as she tried to project authority and calm in a crisis situation. "You don't want to hurt me. You're angry and you're in pain, but hurting me won't bring your mother back or make you feel better. It will only create more pain for everyone who loves you, including your father." But Tyler was beyond listening, beyond reasoning, caught in the grip of emotions he'd suppressed for too long. Jake's horse shifted restlessly beneath him as he watched the scene unfold through the kitchen window, his hands tightening on the reins as he recognized the signs of escalating domestic violence. He'd seen it before during his brief stint as a volunteer firefighter, the way situations could explode from arguments into life-threatening emergencies in the span of seconds. His wife Catherine had worked with victims of domestic abuse during her time as a social worker, and she'd taught him to recognize the warning signs, the patterns of behavior that preceded serious violence. The lamp came down with devastating force, not striking Sarah directly but smashing against the stove where the open flame from the pilot light immediately ignited the spilled kerosene. Fire erupted across the counter and splashed onto Sarah's face and neck as she threw her hands up instinctively to protect herself. Her screams pierced the morning air as flames licked at her skin, the synthetic fabric of her robe catching fire and spreading the burning liquid across her arms and chest. Tyler stumbled backward in horror, the lamp's brass base clattering to the floor as he watched the woman he'd claimed to hate writhing in agony, her hair smoking as she tried desperately to beat out the flames with her bare hands. The kitchen filled with smoke and the terrible smell of burning flesh as Sarah collapsed to the floor, rolling frantically to extinguish the fire that was consuming her robe and blistering her exposed skin. Jake didn't hesitate. He spurred his horse toward the house, dismounting at a full run and crashing through the unlocked front door as Sarah's screams guided him to the kitchen, where he found a scene from his worst nightmares. The young man stood frozen in shock while Sarah writhed on the floor, flames still dancing along the edges of her clothing. Jake grabbed the kitchen curtains and tore them down, smothering the remaining fire on her body before scooping her up in his arms with the gentle strength of someone accustomed to handling injured animals. Her face was a mask of blistered flesh, her left cheek and neck bearing the worst of the burns where the kerosene had splashed and ignited. She was conscious but in shock, her eyes wide with pain and disbelief as Jake carried her toward his truck, barking orders at Tyler, who remained motionless in the doorway. "Call 911 now. Get Dr. Rodriguez on the line and tell her we're coming in with severe burns. Move." But Tyler couldn't move, couldn't process what his anger had unleashed, couldn't reconcile the fantasy of hurting his stepmother with the reality of her agonized screams and blistered flesh. Jake didn't wait for the boy to respond. He placed Sarah gently in the passenger seat of his truck, her conscious moans of pain cutting through him like knife blades as he drove toward town at dangerous speeds, radioing ahead to the clinic on his CB to prepare them for a critical patient. The 20-minute drive to Cedar Falls Medical Clinic became the longest journey of Jake's life as he listened to Sarah's labored breathing and whispered reassurances he wasn't sure she could hear. Her face was swelling rapidly, the burns severe. Enough that he feared permanent damage, and he found himself praying to a God he hadn't spoken to since Catherine's funeral. The woman beside him had always been kind during their brief encounters, had never spoken ill of anyone despite the obvious tension in her household, and didn't deserve this violence from someone who should have protected her. Dr. Emma Rodriguez was waiting at the clinic entrance with Mary Patterson and 2 other nurses, their faces grim as they transferred Sarah to a gurney and rushed her into the treatment room. Jake stood in the hallway with his hands shaking, adrenaline and shock making his legs unsteady as he tried to process what he'd witnessed. The image of Tyler's face as he'd realized what he'd done would haunt Jake for months. The transformation. From rage to horror, the way the boy had seemed to shrink into himself as the reality of his actions hit him like a physical blow. Deputy Dave Collins arrived within minutes, his questions sharp and professional as Jake recounted what he'd seen through the kitchen window and found when he'd entered the house. The deputy's expression grew darker with each detail, his pen moving rapidly across his notepad as he documented what appeared to be a clear case of aggravated assault. Jake's testimony would be crucial, his status as an uninvolved witness lending credibility to what might otherwise become a he said she said situation within the family. Robert Bennett burst through the clinic doors an hour later, his face pale with shock as Frank Morrison's garbled phone call had conveyed only that Sarah was hurt and at the clinic. The sight of Jake Thompson sitting in the waiting room, his clothes stained with blood and his hands still trembling, told Robert more than he wanted to know about the severity of the situation. When Dr. Rodriguez emerged from the treatment room, her expression was carefully neutral in the way that medical professionals maintained when delivering difficult news to family members. "The burns are severe," she told Robert quietly, leading him to a private consultation room where Jake followed at the doctor's invitation, his testimony having made him an integral part of the situation. 2nd and 3rd degree burns on her face, neck, and arms. "We've stabilized her condition and administered pain medication, but she needs specialized treatment at the burn center in Billings. The helicopter is already en route." Robert's face crumpled as the reality hit him, his strong hands covering his face as he processed that his son had nearly killed his wife, that his family had imploded in the most violent way imaginable. Jake watched the man's world collapse and felt the familiar weight of helplessness that had plagued him since Catherine's death, the knowledge that sometimes terrible things happen to good people and there was nothing anyone could do to prevent or fix them. Deputy Collins entered the consultation room with news that Tyler had been found at the house, sitting catatonic in the kitchen, surrounded by the debris of his violence. The boy had offered no resistance when arrested, had barely responded to questions, seeming to exist in a state of shock that suggested he was finally comprehending the magnitude of what his anger had cost him. He would be charged with aggravated assault and held pending a psychological evaluation, his future now as uncertain as Sarah's recovery. As the helicopter landed in the clinic parking lot, Jake helped Robert prepare for the flight to Billings, knowing that the next few days would determine not only Sarah's physical recovery, but the future of what remained of the Bennett family. The quiet rancher who had simply been taking his morning ride had become the key witness in a case that would divide the small town of Cedar Falls, forcing neighbors to choose sides and examine their own complicity in ignoring the warning signs that had been building for months. The helicopter lifted off into the gray Montana sky, carrying Sarah towards specialized treatment while below, Jake Thompson stood alone in the parking lot, watching until the aircraft disappeared into the distance. His morning ride had ended with him becoming the unlikely hero in a story of domestic violence and family destruction, his testimony the only thing standing between justice and the kind of willful blindness that allowed such tragedies to occur. In small towns where people preferred to mind their own business until someone's screams shattered the peaceful facade forever, News traveled fast in Cedar Falls, Montana, carried on the wind of whispered conversations at Mountain View Diner and hushed phone calls between neighbors who claimed they'd always suspected something wasn't right at the Bennett house. By noon, the entire town knew that Sarah Mitchell had been helicoptered to the burn center in Billings with severe injuries, that Tyler Bennett sat in the county jail charged with aggravated assault, and that Jake Thompson had somehow become the hero of a story nobody wanted to believe could happen in their quiet community. Mary Patterson stood behind the reception desk at Cedar Falls Medical Clinic, her hands shaking as she fielded call after call from concerned residents, reporters from the regional newspaper, and family members trying to understand how a Tuesday morning had exploded into such violence. She'd worked alongside Sarah for 2 years, had shared countless lunch breaks listening to the younger woman's patient attempts to connect with her hostile stepson, had offered advice that now seemed woefully inadequate in the face of such brutality. Frank Morrison held court at Pine Ridge Hardware Store, his usual audience of morning coffee drinkers hanging on every word as he recounted what he'd heard from Deputy Collins, embellishing details with each retelling until the story took on mythic proportions. According to Frank's version, Tyler had doused Sarah with gasoline and tried to burn her alive. Jake had fought through walls of flame to rescue her, and the boy had laughed maniacally while watching his stepmother burn. The truth was horrific. Enough without embellishment, but Cedar Falls had always been a town that thrived on drama, where mundane lives were enlivened by the misfortunes of others. Pastor Jim Walsh found himself fielding visits from parishioners who wanted to discuss the theological implications of a son attacking his father's wife, whether forgiveness was possible for such violence, and how their small community should respond to a tragedy that challenged their carefully maintained illusions about family values and Christian charity. At the county jail, Tyler Bennett sat on a narrow cot staring at concrete walls that seemed to close in with each passing hour. The initial shock had worn off, replaced by a crushing awareness of what his rage had accomplished. His hands still smelled of kerosene despite repeated washing, and every time he closed his eyes, he saw Sarah's face as the flames caught her skin, heard her screams echoing in his memory like an accusation that would follow him forever. Dr. Emma Rodriguez had worked in emergency medicine long enough to recognize the signs of domestic violence, but she'd never expected to treat such severe burns inflicted by a family member in her small-town clinic. She'd known Tyler since he was a child, had treated him for scraped knees and broken bones during his reckless teenage years, had watched his transformation from a normal kid into an angry young man consumed by grief and resentment. The helicopter ride to Billings had been a nightmare of medical interventions, Sarah drifting in and out of consciousness while Robert held her unburned hand and whispered apologies for not seeing how dangerous his son had become. The burn unit specialists worked with efficient precision, their experience with industrial accidents and house fires preparing them for the delicate work of saving not just Sarah's life, but hopefully her appearance and function. Jake Thompson returned to his ranch that afternoon carrying the weight of images he couldn't shake from his mind. The silence that had been his refuge since Catherine's death now felt oppressive, filled with the echoes of Sarah's screams and the memory of Tyler's frozen face as he'd realized what he'd done. The horses sensed his agitation, gathering near the fence as he stood in his kitchen, drinking coffee that tasted like ash and staring at hands that still trembled from carrying a burning woman to safety. His neighbor, elderly Mrs. Henderson, called to check on him after hearing about his involvement from her grandson, who worked at the sheriff's department. Jake found himself struggling to describe what he'd witnessed, the way violence had erupted from what appeared to be a normal morning, how quickly a family could destroy itself when anger overcame reason. Mrs. Henderson listened with the patience of someone who'd survived 8 decades of human tragedy, offering practical support in the form of casseroles and the promise to feed his livestock if he needed to testify in court. Robert Bennett spent the first night at Billings General Hospital, sleeping in an uncomfortable chair beside Sarah's bed, watching machines monitor her vital signs while nurses adjusted medication drips and checked her bandages with professional gentleness. Her face was wrapped in specialized burn dressings that made her nearly unrecognizable, only her brown eyes visible through carefully positioned openings that allowed her to see and breathe. The burn unit doctor, a serious woman named Dr. Patricia Chun, explained that Sarah's recovery would be measured in months rather than weeks, that skin grafts would be necessary to repair the worst damage, that her left ear had been severely burned and might require reconstruction. The prognosis was cautiously optimistic for survival, but the extent of scarring wouldn't be known for several weeks as the healing process revealed which damaged tissue could regenerate and which would need surgical intervention. Deputy Collins spent Tuesday evening interviewing neighbors who admitted they'd heard raised voices from the Bennett house, but had chosen not to investigate, following the small-town code of minding their own business until someone got hurt badly, enough to require medical attention. Mrs. Dolores Martinez, who lived across the street, tearfully admitted she'd seen Tyler stumbling home drunk multiple times, but hadn't wanted to cause trouble for Robert, who seemed like such a nice man dealing with his own grief. The investigation revealed a pattern of escalating behavior that multiple people had witnessed, but nobody had reported to authorities. Linda Chun, the high school guidance counselor, acknowledged that Tyler's grades had been declining and his behavior had become increasingly aggressive, but family problems were often handled privately in their community unless violence crossed certain thresholds. At Mountain View Diner, the usual evening crowd gathered to dissect the day's events over coffee and pie, their conversations revealing the complex dynamics of a small town where everyone knew everyone else's business, felt powerless to intervene in family situations until tragedy forced their hand. Some blamed Robert for not controlling his son. Others criticized Sarah for not leaving when Tyler's hostility became obvious. And a few quietly wondered if Jake Thompson had acted quickly enough, or if he'd hesitated too long before intervening. Jake found himself unable to sleep, his mind replaying the morning's events and questioning every decision he'd made. Should he have intervened sooner when he'd noticed the argument through the window? Could he have prevented Sarah's injuries if he'd acted faster? The questions tormented him as he walked his property under starlight, his boots crunching through frost that reminded him of the ice crystals he'd seen on the Bennett kitchen window. Just hours before everything exploded, the horses followed him along the fence line, their presence offering comfort in a way that human contact couldn't match. Jake had always been more comfortable with animals than people, finding their honest reactions preferable to the complex emotions and hidden motivations that seemed to drive human behavior toward violence and betrayal. Catherine had been the exception, the only person who'd understood his need for solitude while offering companionship that enhanced rather than diminished his peace. Tyler's cell became an echo chamber for regret and self-recrimination as he faced the first night of what would likely be many years behind bars. The public defender assigned to his case had visited briefly, a tired woman who'd handled dozens of domestic violence cases and approached Tyler's situation with professional detachment that offered little comfort. She'd explained that aggravated assault with severe bodily injury carried a potential sentence of 10 to 20 years, that his best hope lay in pleading mental illness or temporary insanity brought on by grief. But Tyler knew he couldn't hide behind grief anymore. Couldn't pretend that losing his mother justified the rage that had been building in him for years. He'd chosen to drink, chosen to resent Sarah's presence, chosen to escalate verbal abuse into physical intimidation, and finally chosen to grab that lamp with the intention of frightening her. That the lamp had broken and ignited was an accident, but his decision to use it as a weapon had been deliberate. The county jail's night sounds became a soundtrack of regret as Tyler listened to other inmates talking, snoring pacing in their cells. Some were repeat offenders who treated incarceration as a temporary inconvenience. Others were first-time criminals whose situations resembled his own domestic disputes that had escalated beyond control. He found no comfort in their company, no sense of belonging among people whose poor choices had led them to the same concrete walls and metal bars. Robert spent Wednesday morning meeting with doctors, social workers, and victim advocates who explained the resources available to support Sarah's recovery and his family's healing process. The financial burden would be enormous despite their insurance, the emotional toll incalculable as they navigated not only Sarah's physical rehabilitation but the legal proceedings against Tyler and the community judgment that would follow them. For years, Sarah regained consciousness Wednesday afternoon, her first words asking about Tyler despite the agony of speaking through burned lips and a throat damaged by smoke inhalation. Robert struggled to explain their son's arrest, the charges he faced, the likelihood that their family would never recover from this act of violence. Sarah's tears mixed with the medical ointment on her cheeks, creating a painful reminder of how completely their lives had been altered by one moment of unchecked rage. Dr. Rodriguez called Jake Wednesday evening to thank him for his quick action, explaining that Sarah's survival was directly attributable to his immediate response in smothering the flames and getting her to medical care. Without his intervention, the burns would have continued consuming her flesh, likely proving fatal or causing damage so extensive that recovery would have been impossible. Jake accepted her gratitude awkwardly, uncomfortable with being labeled a hero for doing what any decent person would have done in similar circumstances. The call from Dr. Rodriguez forced Jake to confront his own complicated feelings about the morning's events. He'd been riding past the Bennett house for months, had occasionally noticed raised voices or glimpsed arguments through windows, but had followed the unspoken rural code of respecting privacy and avoiding involvement in domestic situations. His intervention had been instinctive rather than planned, driven by immediate necessity rather than any heroic impulse. Cedar Falls Elementary School became a battleground of whispered conversations as children repeated garbled versions of adult discussions about the Bennett family tragedy. Teachers found themselves addressing questions from students who'd heard their parents talking about Tyler's violence, Sarah's injuries, and Jake's rescue. Principal Margaret Foster sent a letter home to parents explaining that counselors were available to help children process the community trauma and asking adults to be mindful of their conversations around young ears. The regional newspaper ran a front-page story Thursday morning under the headline, "Local Rancher Saves Woman from Burning in Domestic Violence Attack," complete with file photos of Jake, Sarah, and Tyler that had been obtained from yearbooks and church directories. The article portrayed Jake as a humble hero who'd risked his life to save a neighbor, Sarah as an innocent victim of family violence, and Tyler as a troubled young man whose grief had transformed into rage. Jake's phone began ringing before dawn Thursday as reporters from larger newspapers and television stations requested interviews about his role in the rescue. He declined them all, uncomfortable with media attention that threatened to transform a private act of human decency into public spectacle. His mailbox filled with letters from strangers praising his heroism, offering prayers for Sarah's recovery, and condemning Tyler's violence in language that made Jake uncomfortable with its vehemence. The story resonated beyond Cedar Falls because it contained elements that touched universal fears about family safety, domestic violence, and the thin line between normal family conflict and life-threatening assault. Chat rooms and social media platforms buzzed with discussions about warning signs that neighbors and community members should recognize, the responsibility of bystanders to intervene in domestic situations, and the long-term consequences of untreated grief and mental health issues. But Jake wasn't interested in becoming a symbol or spokesperson for any cause. He'd acted on instinct to help someone in immediate danger, and the attention made him yearn for the anonymity that had been his refuge since Catherine's death. The ranch that had been his sanctuary now felt exposed, invaded by curiosity seekers. who drove slowly past his gate, hoping to glimpse the man whose quick thinking had saved Sarah Mitchell's life. Thursday evening brought the first of many difficult conversations between Robert and Tyler, conducted through reinforced glass at the county jail under the supervision of guards who'd seen too many family tragedies to be surprised by anything. Tyler looked younger in his orange jumpsuit, diminished by the reality of incarceration in a way that made Robert's heart break. Even as he struggled with anger over what his son had done to Sarah, the conversation was stilted, filled with apologies that felt inadequate and explanations that couldn't justify the violence. Tyler tried to express his regret, but words seemed powerless against the magnitude of his actions. Robert wanted to forgive his son, wanted to find a path toward healing and redemption, but the image of Sarah's burned face made compassion difficult to sustain. They were still family, but that relationship had been fundamentally altered by fire and would never return to its previous form. Tyler's preliminary hearing was scheduled for the following Monday, giving both families time to hire attorneys and prepare for legal proceedings that would likely drag on for months. The public defender had already indicated that Tyler's best option would be pleading guilty to reduce charges in exchange for a shorter sentence. But even the most optimistic scenarios involved several years in prison for assault causing serious bodily injury. The weekend brought a steady stream of visitors to Jake's ranch, some genuinely concerned about his welfare, others driven by curiosity about the man who'd become Cedar Falls' unlikely hero. Pastor Walsh stopped by Saturday morning to offer spiritual counseling and found Jake cleaning horse stalls with the methodical precision of someone seeking solace in physical labor. Their conversation was brief, Jake politely declining offers of prayer or community support, while expressing genuine concern for Sarah's recovery and the Bennett family's future. Frank Morrison arrived Saturday afternoon with a six-pack of beer and stories about similar incidents he'd heard about in other small towns, his gossipy nature warring with genuine admiration for Jake's quick thinking and decisive action. Jake listened politely but offered little encouragement for Frank's theories about warning signs the community should have recognized or preventive measures that might have avoided the tragedy. Sunday brought the most difficult visitor of all when Robert Bennett drove out to the ranch to personally thank Jake for saving Sarah's life. The conversation was awkward, filled with gratitude that neither man knew how to express adequately, and grief that transcended their limited relationship as casual neighbors. Robert looked older, worn down by the weight of his son's violence and his wife's uncertain recovery, carrying guilt for not recognizing how dangerous Tyler had become. Jake offered what comfort he could, but both men understood that some tragedies couldn't be healed with words or gestures. Sarah would carry physical and emotional scars for the rest of her life. Tyler would spend his young adulthood in prison, and their family would never recover the innocence that had been lost in those terrible moments, when anger overwhelmed reason and love was replaced by violence. The ranch that had been Jake's refuge would forever be associated with the morning he'd witnessed one family's destruction and acted to prevent even greater tragedy. The courthouse in Cedar Falls had never hosted a more contentious hearing than Tyler Bennett's preliminary appearance on Monday morning, with every available seat filled by townspeople whose opinions about the case had already crystallized into hardened positions that would define community relationships for years to come. Judge Patricia Williams, a stern woman in her 60s who presided over countless domestic disputes, looked down at the young man in shackles with an expression that conveyed both professional detachment and personal dismay at the severity of his alleged crimes. District Attorney Michael Chun, no relation to the school counselor despite sharing a surname, presented the state's case with methodical precision that left no doubt about the prosecution's intention to seek maximum penalties for what he characterized as an unprovoked attack on a defenseless woman by someone who should have protected rather than harmed her. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable, he explained to the packed courtroom. supported by eyewitness testimony from a respected community member who'd risked his own safety to intervene in act of shocking domestic violence. Tyler's public defender, Sandra Martinez, a overworked woman with premature gray hair and tired eyes, offered a plea for reduced charges based on her client's age, his lack of prior violent offenses, and the traumatic grief that had clearly compromised his judgment and emotional stability. She painted a picture of a young man destroyed by losing his mother at a formative age, failed by a mental health system that didn't recognize or address his deteriorating psychological condition, and ultimately driven to violence by untreated depression and substance abuse that had gone unnoticed by family and community members. The judge's questions were sharp and probing, focusing particularly on the extent of Sarah's injuries and the likelihood of permanent disfigurement that would affect her quality of life for decades to come. Medical testimony from Dr. Rodriguez and the Billings burn specialists painted a grim picture of multiple surgeries, extensive scarring, possible hearing loss, and psychological trauma that might never fully heal. Tyler sat motionless throughout these descriptions, his face pale and his hands trembling as he listened to the clinical details of what his moment of rage had cost another human being. Jake Thompson occupied a seat in the front row, uncomfortable with the attention his presence generated, but recognizing his obligation to provide testimony that might help determine Tyler's fate and Sarah's future. He'd spoken with both attorneys over the weekend, describing exactly what he'd witnessed through the kitchen window and found when he'd entered the Bennett house. His account was factual and unemotional, but the implications were devastating for any defense strategy based on accidental injury or mutual combat. The preliminary hearing concluded with Judge Williams ordering Tyler held without bail pending a psychiatric evaluation and formal indictment by the grand jury, a decision that prompted audible gasps from some spectators and nods of approval from others. The young man who'd walked into court as Robert Bennett's troubled son walked out as an accused felon whose future would be determined by the criminal justice system rather than family forgiveness or community intervention. Robert Bennett emerged from the courthouse looking years older than when he'd entered, his face etched with lines of stress and grief that seemed to have deepened during the brief proceedings. Reporters surrounded him immediately, shouting questions about his son's mental health, his knowledge of Tyler's violent tendencies, and his plans for supporting Sarah's recovery while dealing with his son's incarceration. Robert pushed through the crowd without comment, his silence speaking volumes about a man overwhelmed by circumstances beyond his control or comprehension. Sarah's condition at Billings General had stabilized enough to allow visitors beyond immediate family, and Mary Patterson made the 3-hour drive Tuesday morning to see her friend and colleague for the first time since the attack. The sight of Sarah's bandaged face and burned hands was shocking despite Mary's medical training, the reality of her injuries far worse than clinical descriptions had conveyed. Sarah's voice was barely a whisper through damaged vocal cords, but her first concern was for Tyler's welfare and her hope that the legal system would recognize his need for mental health treatment rather than simple punishment. The conversation between the two women was painful and halting, interrupted by medical procedures and Sarah's frequent need to rest as her body continued fighting infection and beginning the long process of healing. Mary struggled to maintain professional composure while witnessing her friend's suffering, knowing that Sarah's physical recovery represented only the beginning of a journey that would include psychological counseling, reconstructive surgery, and the challenge of rebuilding her identity around permanent disfigurement. Dr. Jennifer Walsh, a psychiatrist from Billings who specialized in criminal evaluations, spent Wednesday afternoon interviewing Tyler in the county jail, her assessment crucial to determining whether mental illness had played a role in his violent behavior. Tyler answered her questions with surprising honesty, describing the rage that had been building in him for years, his resentment toward Sarah for replacing his mother, and his increasing reliance on alcohol to numb emotions he didn't know how to process constructively. The psychiatric evaluation revealed a young man suffering from complicated grief disorder, depression, and alcohol dependency, but stopped short of finding him legally insane or incapable of understanding the consequences of his actions. Dr. Walsh's report would indicate that Tyler had been mentally ill but legally competent when he attacked Sarah, a finding that would allow prosecutors to pursue felony charges, while potentially supporting arguments for reduced sentencing based on mitigating psychological factors. Jake found himself struggling with unexpected notoriety as news of his intervention spread beyond Cedar Falls through social media and regional news coverage that portrayed him as a reluctant hero whose quick thinking had saved a woman's life. His mailbox filled with letters from strangers, speaking requests from community organizations, and interview proposals from journalists who wanted to explore themes of bystander intervention and community responsibility in domestic violence situations. The attention was particularly unwelcome because it forced Jake to relive Catherine's death and his own struggles with survivor's guilt over not being able to save his wife from the car accident that had claimed her life 2 years earlier. The parallels between his successful rescue of Sarah and his failure to prevent Catherine's death created emotional turmoil that he wasn't prepared to address publicly or even privately with the counselors who'd reached out offering their services. Thursday brought unwelcome visitors to Jake's ranch in the form of television news crews who'd driven up from Billings and Great Falls to interview the man whose heroic actions had captured regional attention. Jake refused all requests for on-camera interviews, but their presence attracted curiosity seekers who parked along the county road hoping to glimpse the reluctant hero whose story had touched something deep in people's hearts about human decency and moral courage. The media attention also attracted less welcome visitors, including a group of men's rights activists who wanted to use Tyler's case to argue that male violence was often misunderstood and that women frequently provoked attacks through emotional manipulation. Jake ordered them off his property with language that left no doubt about his opinion of their theories, but their presence reminded him that his involvement in the case had made him a public figure whose privacy and peace might never fully return. Frank Morrison's hardware store became an unofficial headquarters for community debate about the Bennett family tragedy, with regular customers taking sides based on their personal relationships with the family members and their philosophical positions about domestic violence, mental health treatment, and criminal justice. Some argued that Tyler deserved compassion as a grieving young man whose actions resulted from untreated psychological problems, while others insisted that violence against women could never be excused regardless of the perpetrator's mental state. Pastor Jim Walsh found himself counseling parishioners whose faith had been shaken by the brutality of Tyler's attack and their own failure to recognize warning signs that might have prevented the tragedy. Several congregation members admitted they'd heard disturbing rumors about Tyler's behavior, but had chosen not to get involved in family matters, a decision they now regretted as they struggled with guilt over their inaction and questions about their Christian duty to protect vulnerable community members. The grand jury convened Friday morning to consider formal charges against Tyler, with District Attorney Chen presenting evidence that included Jake's eyewitness testimony, medical records documenting the extent of Sarah's injuries, and photographs of the Bennett kitchen that showed the violence and destruction Tyler's rage had unleashed. The proceedings were conducted in secret, but the outcome seemed predetermined given the overwhelming evidence of aggravated assault resulting in serious bodily injury. Tyler's indictment on charges of aggravated assault, arson, and terroristic threats was announced Friday afternoon, carrying potential sentences that could keep him incarcerated well into his 30s if convicted on all counts. The formal charges reflected the prosecution's determination to hold him fully accountable for his actions while sending a message to the community that domestic violence would be prosecuted to the full extent of the law, regardless of family dynamics or psychological mitigating factors. Robert Bennett received the news of his son's indictment while sitting beside Sarah's hospital bed, where she was preparing for the first of several reconstructive surgeries designed to minimize scarring and restore function to her damaged facial muscles. The timing felt particularly cruel, forcing him to choose between supporting his injured wife and his incarcerated son, both of whom needed his presence and attention during the most difficult period of their lives. Sarah's reaction to Tyler's indictment surprised everyone who heard about it, as she expressed hope that the legal proceedings would force him to confront his problems and receive the mental health treatment he'd resisted for years. Her forgiveness seemed impossible to comprehend for people who'd never experienced such violence, but her nursing background had taught her to separate the person from their actions and to believe in the possibility of redemption even in the darkest circumstances. The weekend brought the first of many difficult conversations between Sarah and Robert about their future together, complicated by Tyler's crimes and the community's reaction to their family tragedy. Some people blamed Robert for not controlling his son's behavior. Others criticized Sarah for not leaving when Tyler's hostility became obvious, and many simply avoided the family altogether to escape the uncomfortable reality that domestic violence could occur in any household regardless of social standing or religious faith. Jake spent the weekend working on ranch maintenance projects that had been neglected during the week's chaos, finding solace in physical labor that tired his body and quieted his mind. The horses seemed to sense his emotional turmoil gathering near him as he repaired fence posts and cleaned out water troughs, their presence offering comfort that human companionship couldn't provide. The rhythm of familiar tasks helped him process the week's events while avoiding the phone calls and visitor requests that continued arriving despite his clearly stated desire for privacy. Sunday morning brought an unexpected visitor in the form of Tyler's aunt, Margaret Bennett, Robert's sister who'd driven down from Kalispell to better understand what had happened to her nephew and whether anything could be done to help him avoid the lengthy prison sentence he was facing. Margaret had been close to Tyler during his childhood, serving as a surrogate mother figure during his biological mother's final illness, and she struggled to reconcile her memories of a sweet, sensitive boy with the violent young man who'd nearly killed his stepmother. The conversation between Jake and Margaret was awkward and painful, with her seeking explanations he couldn't provide and hoping for testimony that might support a more sympathetic portrayal of Tyler's character. Jake listened respectfully to her descriptions of Tyler's childhood trauma and her theories about how grief had transformed him, but he couldn't ignore what he'd witnessed through the kitchen window or minimize the severity of Sarah's injuries to ease a family's suffering. Margaret left the ranch with a deeper understanding of the case against Tyler, but no hope that Jake's testimony could be used to support arguments for leniency or reduced charges. The evidence was simply too clear and the injuries too severe for any narrative that portrayed Tyler as more victim than perpetrator, regardless of the psychological factors that had contributed to his violent behavior. Monday brought news that Sarah had survived her first reconstructive surgery, with doctors cautiously optimistic about restoring some function to her damaged facial muscles, while warning that multiple additional procedures would be necessary over the coming months. The medical team emphasized that her recovery would be measured in years rather than months, with no guarantee that she would ever regain her previous appearance or escape the psychological trauma of surviving such a violent attack. Tyler's attorney filed motions requesting psychological evaluation and treatment rather than incarceration, arguing that her client's actions resulted from untreated mental illness that could be addressed through intensive therapy and rehabilitation programs. The motions were expected given Tyler's psychological profile, but they faced an uphill battle against a prosecution team determined to hold him accountable for choices that had caused irreparable harm to an innocent woman who'd tried to help him heal from his grief. The case had become a flashpoint for community debates about mental health resources, domestic violence prevention, and the responsibility of bystanders to intervene when they witness warning signs of escalating family conflict. School board meetings and town council sessions were dominated by discussions of how Cedar Falls could better identify and address the kind of problems that had led to Tyler's violent explosion, with proposals ranging from expanded counseling services to mandatory reporting requirements for suspected domestic abuse. Jake found himself increasingly isolated as the community's focus on preventing future tragedies forced residents to examine their own complicity in ignoring warning signs and avoiding involvement in family situations that might have benefited from outside intervention. His role as the key witness had made him a symbol of moral courage, but it had also highlighted how many other people had chosen to look away rather than risk the complications that came with getting involved in domestic disputes. The transformation of a quiet Tuesday morning into a community-defining tragedy had exposed the fault lines that existed beneath Cedar Falls' peaceful surface, revealing how quickly neighbor could turn against neighbor when forced to choose sides. In a situation that challenged their assumptions about family, violence, and moral responsibility. Jake's intervention had saved Sarah's life, but it had also shattered the comfortable illusion that such violence couldn't happen in their small town among people they'd known for years. The trial of Tyler Bennett began on a crisp October morning, 6 months after the attack, with maple trees surrounding the courthouse, displaying brilliant shades of gold and crimson that seemed to mock the darkness of the proceedings taking place inside. The jury selection had taken 3 days, complicated by the extensive media coverage and the fact that nearly every potential juror in the county had formed opinions about the case based on months of speculation and gossip that had divided Cedar Falls into warring camps of sympathy and condemnation. Jake Thompson sat in the witness waiting room, his testimony scheduled for the second day of proceedings, reviewing the statement he'd given to police while trying to prepare himself emotionally for reliving those terrible moments when he'd witnessed Tyler's rage explode into violence. The months since the attack had not diminished the clarity of his memories, and he could still see Sarah's face as the flames caught her skin, still hear her screams echoing across the frosted morning air that had seemed so peaceful before everything changed. District Attorney Chen opened the prosecution's case with photographs of Sarah's injuries that caused several jurors to gasp audibly and one elderly woman to request a brief recess to compose herself. The clinical documentation of burned flesh and damaged tissue painted a stark picture of suffering that no amount of legal maneuvering could minimize or explain away. Tyler sat motionless at the defense table, his face pale and his hands folded, as he confronted the visual evidence of what his anger had accomplished. Sarah Mitchell entered the courtroom on the trial's 3rd day, her first public appearance since the attack, wearing a silk scarf that partially concealed the scarring on her neck, while highlighting the permanent damage to her left ear and cheek. The collective intake of breath from spectators was audible as people saw for the first time the true cost of Tyler's violence, the way his moment of rage had transformed a vibrant woman into someone whose appearance would forever mark her as a survivor of domestic brutality. Her testimony was delivered in a voice that remained hoarse from smoke damage, each word carefully pronounced through reconstructed facial muscles that had required 4 surgeries to restore basic function. Sarah described the morning of the attack with clinical precision, her nursing training evident in the way she recounted medical details, while maintaining emotional distance from the trauma she was reliving for the jury's benefit. When asked about her relationship with Tyler before the attack, Sarah's testimony revealed years of escalating hostility that she'd minimized to herself and others, hoping that patience and understanding would eventually break through his grief and anger. She described finding her belongings destroyed, her car vandalized, her attempts at conversation met with increasingly vicious verbal abuse that she'd attributed to adolescent acting out rather than recognizing as warning signs of potential violence. Tyler's defense attorney cross-examined Sarah with careful respect, focusing on her acknowledgement that Tyler had been drinking the morning of the attack and her admission that she'd sometimes felt afraid of his unpredictable moods. The strategy seemed designed to establish diminished capacity rather than challenge Sarah's credibility, recognizing that attacking a burn victim would likely backfire with jurors who were already visibly sympathetic to her suffering. The prosecution's case reached its climax when Jake Thompson took the witness stand, his quiet voice carrying clearly through the packed courtroom as he described his morning ride and the scene that had unfolded through the Bennett kitchen window. His testimony was factual and unemotional, but the impact was devastating as he recounted Tyler's deliberate grab for the kerosene lamp and the explosion of violence that had followed. Under cross-examination, Jake acknowledged that he'd been riding past the Bennett house for months and had occasionally noticed signs of domestic tension, but he maintained that nothing he'd observed had suggested the potential for life-threatening violence. The defense attorney's attempts to suggest that Jake should have intervened sooner or that his testimony was influenced by hindsight fell flat with jurors who seemed to view him as an honest man doing his civic duty. The defense's strategy became clear when they called Dr. Jennifer Walsh to testify about Tyler's psychological evaluation, painting a picture of a young man destroyed by untreated grief and clinical depression, who had turned to alcohol to numb emotional pain that his family and community had failed to recognize or address. Tyler's Aunt Margaret provided character testimony about his childhood, sweetness, and his devastating reaction to his mother's death, while his former teachers described a bright student whose academic performance had collapsed after his family tragedy. Tyler himself took the stand on the trial's 8th day, his testimony a mixture of remorse and explanation that seemed genuine but insufficient given the severity of Sarah's injuries. He described the rage that had been building in him for years, his resentment toward Sarah for what he perceived as replacing his mother, and his increasing reliance on alcohol to escape feelings he didn't know how to process constructively. When asked directly about the morning of the attack, Tyler's voice broke as he described grabbing the lamp with the intention of frightening Sarah, not burning her, and his horror when the kerosene ignited and engulfed her in flames. His tears seemed authentic, but the prosecution's cross-examination forced him to acknowledge that he'd made deliberate choices to drink, to escalate verbal abuse into physical intimidation, and ultimately to grab a weapon that he'd intended to use to terrorize a woman who'd never harmed him. The prosecution's closing argument focused relentlessly on choice and accountability, emphasizing that Tyler's psychological problems didn't excuse his decision to commit violence against a defenseless woman who'd tried to help him heal from his grief. District Attorney Chen reminded jurors that thousands of people suffered from depression and substance abuse without attacking family members, that Tyler's actions had been deliberate rather than impulsive, and that Sarah would carry the consequences of his choices for the rest of her life. Defense attorney Martinez made an emotional plea for mercy, arguing that Tyler's youth, his lack of prior violent offenses, and his obvious mental health problems warranted consideration of manslaughter rather than aggravated assault charges. She emphasized his genuine remorse and his need for treatment rather than lengthy incarceration, suggesting that justice would be better served by rehabilitation than punishment. The jury deliberated for 2 days before returning guilty verdicts on all charges, their decision apparently influenced more by the severity of Sarah's injuries and the deliberate nature of Tyler's actions than by sympathy for his psychological problems. Judge Williams scheduled sentencing for the following month, giving both sides time to prepare arguments about appropriate punishment for a crime that had shocked the community and destroyed multiple lives. Jake found himself emotionally drained by the trial proceedings, the weeks of testimony having forced him to relive not only Tyler's attack on Sarah, but also his own memories of Catherine's death and his ongoing struggle with survivor's guilt. The parallels between his successful intervention in Sarah's case and his inability to save his wife created psychological turmoil that he'd avoided addressing during the months of media attention and community scrutiny. Sarah's return to work at Cedar Falls Medical Clinic was gradual and difficult, her scarred appearance drawing stares and whispered comments from patients who struggled to reconcile her altered face with their memories of the attractive nurse who'd treated their families. Her voice remained permanently hoarse, her hearing had been damaged by the fire, and her left hand bore contracture scars that limited her dexterity in performing medical procedures. The psychological impact of the attack proved more challenging than the physical injuries, with Sarah experiencing nightmares, panic attacks, and hypervigilance that made her jump at sudden sounds or movements. Dr. Amanda Foster, a trauma counselor from Billings, worked with Sarah twice weekly to address post-traumatic stress symptoms that interfered with her ability to sleep, concentrate, or feel safe in her own home. Robert Bennett aged visibly during his son's trial, the stress of supporting his wife's recovery, while witnessing his son's conviction taking a toll that was evident to everyone who knew him. His relationship with Sarah had been strained by the attack, not through any fault of hers, but because her presence served as a constant reminder of Tyler's violence and the family's destruction. Their marriage would survive, but it would never return to its previous intimacy and trust. Tyler's sentencing hearing drew another packed courtroom, with victim impact statements from Sarah and Robert balanced against character, testimony from family members and former teachers who hoped to influence Judge Williams toward a more lenient sentence. Sarah's statement was particularly powerful as she described not only her physical suffering, but her ongoing fear and the way Tyler's violence had stolen her sense of security and self-confidence. Tyler himself made a brief statement accepting responsibility for his actions and expressing genuine remorse for the pain he'd caused, but his words seemed inadequate given the magnitude of his crimes. Judge Williams sentenced him to 15 years in state prison with the possibility of parole after serving 10 years, a punishment that satisfied neither those who wanted him to serve life nor those who'd hoped for a sentence focused on rehabilitation rather than incarceration. The community of Cedar Falls slowly began healing from the trauma of Tyler's attack and trial, though the divisions created by the case would persist for years as residents continued debating questions of mental health, domestic violence, and community responsibility. The Bennett house on Maple Street was sold within months of Tyler's conviction, Robert and Sarah relocating to a smaller home across town where they could escape the memories and neighborhood gossip that made recovery impossible. Jake Thompson returned to the solitude of his ranch with relief, grateful to escape the media attention and community scrutiny that had transformed him from a private man into a reluctant public figure. His testimony had helped convict Tyler, but the experience had forced him to confront his own unresolved grief and his complicated feelings about being unable to save Catherine while successfully rescuing Sarah. The horses welcomed him back to their routine with apparent pleasure, gathering at the fence each morning as he began his daily chores with the methodical precision that had always been his refuge from emotional turmoil. The ranch that had been invaded by reporters and curiosity seekers gradually returned to its peaceful isolation, though Jake knew that his involvement in Tyler's case had permanently altered his relationship with the community and his own sense of privacy. Winter arrived early that year, blanketing the ranch in snow that muffled sound and created the kind of pristine silence that Jake had always found restorative. His morning rides resumed their familiar pattern, though he now varied his route. To avoid passing the former Bennett property, where new owners were renovating the kitchen and trying to erase the lingering traces of violence that had occurred there. Sarah's recovery continued through the winter months, each small improvement in her mobility and appearance celebrated by the medical team that had worked so hard to save not just her life but her ability to function normally. The scarring would never disappear completely, but skilled plastic surgeons had restored enough symmetry to her face that strangers wouldn't immediately recognize her as a burn victim. Her relationship with Robert deepened through their shared trauma, the attack paradoxically strengthening their marriage by forcing them to confront fundamental questions about love, forgiveness, and commitment that many couples never had to address. They attended counseling sessions together, working through the complex emotions surrounding Tyler's violence and their own futures as a family forever changed by one morning's explosion of rage. Tyler began serving his sentence at Montana State Prison, where he was enrolled in educational programs and psychological counseling designed to address the mental health issues that had contributed to his violent behavior. His letters to Sarah and Robert were filled with remorse and gradual self-awareness, though none of them expected his eventual release to restore their relationship to any semblance of normalcy. The case had attracted attention from domestic violence prevention organizations who used Tyler's story to illustrate the importance of recognizing warning signs and intervening before family tensions escalated into life-threatening violence. Sarah became an occasional speaker at conferences and training sessions, sharing her experience to help others avoid similar tragedies while advocating for better mental health resources in rural communities. Jake remained uncomfortable with his designation as a hero, preferring to view his intervention as simple human decency rather than extraordinary courage. His mailbox still occasionally received letters from strangers inspired by his story, but the media attention had largely faded as other news captured public interest and Cedar Falls returned to its usual quiet rhythms. Spring brought new growth to the ranch, with colts born to his mares and pastures turning green under longer days that reminded Jake of the cycles of renewal that persisted despite human tragedy. His morning rides revealed the subtle changes that marked seasonal transitions, the way life continued its ancient patterns regardless of the violence and suffering that periodically disrupted human communities. The anniversary of Tyler's attack passed quietly, marked only by a brief newspaper article summarizing the case and its aftermath. Sarah spent the day at work, her scarred hands steady as she administered medications and comforted patients who needed her professional skills and personal understanding of survival. Robert visited Tyler in prison, their conversation awkward but necessary as they tried to maintain some connection, despite the crimes that had destroyed their family. Jake rode past the former Bennett property that morning, noting the new paint and landscaping that had transformed it from a site of tragedy into just another house in a small Montana town. The kitchen window had been replaced, erasing the last physical evidence of the violence he'd witnessed, though his memories remained as clear as ever. The case had changed all of them in ways that would persist long after the legal proceedings concluded and media attention faded. Sarah would carry physical and emotional scars that served as daily reminders of how quickly love could transform into violence when grief and anger overwhelmed reason. Robert would live with guilt over his failure to recognize his son's dangerous psychological deterioration before it exploded into attempted murder. Tyler would spend the best years of his young adulthood in prison, his future permanently altered by choices made in moments of rage that he would regret for the rest of his life. His violence had cost him not just his freedom, but any hope of maintaining relationships with the people who tried to help him heal from his mother's death. Jake had returned to his preferred anonymity, but his intervention had demonstrated that moral courage sometimes required ordinary people to act decisively when confronted with extraordinary evil. His quick thinking and willingness to get involved had saved Sarah's life and provided the testimony needed to ensure Tyler's conviction, proving that individual actions could make the difference between tragedy and survival. The small town of Cedar Falls had been forced to confront uncomfortable truths about domestic violence, mental health, and community responsibility that challenged residents' assumptions about their neighbors and themselves. The case had revealed how quickly families could implode when problems were ignored rather than addressed, and how easily bystanders could rationalize their failure to intervene until violence made neutrality impossible. As months turned to years, The intensity of emotion surrounding Tyler's case gradually faded into the background of daily life, though the lessons learned would influence how the community responded to future signs of family dysfunction and domestic tension. The tragedy had cost everyone involved more than they'd ever imagined possible, but it had also demonstrated the resilience of human beings to survive trauma and rebuild their lives from the ashes of violence and betrayal. Sarah Mitchell continued working as a nurse, her experience as a survivor giving her unique insight into helping other victims of violence and trauma. Her scars told a story of survival that inspired patients who were struggling with their own recovery from injury or illness, proving that physical damage didn't have to define a person's future or limit their ability to contribute meaningfully to their community. The silent rancher who'd witnessed her burning and acted to save her life returned to the solitude he'd always preferred, his brief moment of public attention fading into memory as Cedar Falls moved forward from the tragedy that had tested everyone's capacity for justice, forgiveness, and understanding. Jake Thompson remained what he'd always been, a quiet man who'd done what needed to be done when confronted with someone else's desperate need, asking for nothing in return except the privacy to continue living his life according to his own principles and values. 5 years had passed since that October morning when Tyler Bennett's rage had exploded into violence, transforming 3 lives forever and leaving scars that extended far beyond the physical damage visible on Sarah Mitchell's face. The town of Cedar Falls had moved on, as small communities always do, incorporating the tragedy into its collective memory, while new dramas and celebrations claimed the attention of residents, who needed to focus on their own daily struggles rather than dwelling on past horrors. Sarah stood in the bathroom mirror of her new home on Willow Street, carefully applying makeup that had become as much a part of her morning routine as brushing her teeth or combing her hair. The scarring on her left cheek and neck had faded from angry red to pale silver over the years, and skilled plastic surgeons had restored enough symmetry to her features that strangers no longer stared with the uncomfortable fascination that had marked her first months of recovery. Her voice had never fully returned to its previous clarity, maintaining a husky quality that some patients at the clinic found soothing when she spoke to them during difficult procedures or delivered challenging medical news. The hearing loss in her left ear had stabilized, requiring only minor adjustments to her daily life and the occasional request for people to repeat themselves in noisy environments. Robert Bennett appeared in the doorway behind her, his reflection showing a man who had aged more than 5 years during their journey through trauma and recovery. His hair had turned completely gray, and lines around his eyes spoke of sleepless nights spent worrying about his wife's health and his son's future. Their marriage had survived Tyler's attack, but it had been fundamentally altered by the experience, becoming deeper in some ways while losing the easy intimacy they'd once shared. Today marked Tyler's first parole hearing, and both Sarah and Robert would attend to provide victim impact statements that could influence the board's decision about whether their son was ready for supervised release after serving 5 years of his 15-year sentence. The prospect of seeing Tyler again stirred complex emotions in both of them, mixing genuine hope for his rehabilitation with lingering fear about the young man who had tried to kill his stepmother in a moment of unchecked rage. Dr. Amanda Foster had spent months preparing Sarah for this day, helping her process the conflicting feelings that arose when she thought about facing Tyler across a hearing room table. Sarah's recovery had been remarkable in many ways, but the psychological scars remained tender, despite years of therapy and the loving support of friends and family who had rallied around her during the darkest periods of her healing journey. Jake Thompson began his morning with the same routine that had anchored his life for decades, feeding horses and checking cattle before the sun fully cleared the mountain peaks that surrounded his ranch. The media attention that had briefly made him a reluctant celebrity had long since faded, leaving him with the privacy he'd always valued and the satisfaction of knowing he'd acted decisively when someone needed help desperately. His involvement in Tyler's case had changed him in subtle ways that became apparent only with time and reflection. The nightmares about Catherine's death had gradually diminished, replaced by a sense that perhaps his inability to save his wife had been balanced by his successful intervention on Sarah's behalf. The guilt that had consumed him since the car accident was still present, but it no longer dominated his emotional landscape the way it had during the first lonely years after Catherine's funeral. The horses sensed his mood as he moved among them, their gentle nickers and soft muzzles against his hands, providing the kind of wordless comfort that had sustained him through the worst periods of grief and isolation. Animals understood suffering without requiring explanations or offering empty platitudes, accepting human pain as part of the natural order while providing presence and companionship that asked nothing in return. Tyler Bennett sat in his cell at Montana State Prison, preparing mentally for the parole hearing that would determine whether he'd spend the next several years behind bars or begin the challenging process of reintegrating into a world that had moved on without him. His reflection in the small mirror showed a man rather than the angry teenager who'd entered the system 5 years earlier, his face bearing the gravity that came from truly understanding the consequences of his choices. Prison had been both punishment and education, forcing him to confront not only his actions, but the psychological problems that had driven him toward violence. Years of mandatory counseling had helped him understand the grief and rage that had consumed him after his mother's death, teaching him coping strategies that might have prevented the attack if he'd learned them earlier. The boy who had grabbed that kerosene lamp in a moment of fury had gradually transformed into someone capable of genuine remorse and self-reflection. His cell walls were covered with letters from Sarah and Robert, their correspondence over the years chronicling not only his own growth, but their remarkable journey toward forgiveness and understanding. Sarah's first letter had arrived 6 months after his sentencing, surprising him with its lack of anger and its focus on hope for his rehabilitation rather than demands for additional punishment. Her forgiveness had been harder to accept then. Her hatred would have been, forcing him to examine his own capacity for change and redemption. The educational programs available in prison had allowed Tyler to complete his high school diploma and begin college courses in psychology and social work, fields that appealed to him because of his own experience with mental health struggles and their devastating consequences. His academic performance had been exceptional, earning him recognition from instructors who saw potential for meaningful contribution to society. If he could successfully transition back to civilian life, Dr. Jennifer Walsh reviewed Tyler's psychological evaluation one final time before his parole hearing, noting the dramatic changes in his personality and behavior that had occurred during 5 years of incarceration and intensive therapy. The angry, impulsive teenager had been replaced by a thoughtful young man who demonstrated genuine understanding of his victims' suffering and realistic plans for avoiding the triggers that had previously led to violent behavior. Her assessment would be crucial to the parole board's decision, as would testimony from prison staff who had observed Tyler's interactions with other inmates and his participation in anger management programs, substance abuse counseling, and victim impact education. The consensus among those who worked with him was that he represented a genuine success story for rehabilitation, though everyone understood that his ultimate test would come when he faced the pressures and temptations of life outside prison walls. The parole hearing was scheduled for 2 o'clock in the afternoon at the State Correctional Facility, with Sarah and Robert making the 3-hour drive through mountain passes that displayed autumn colors rivaling those that had surrounded the courthouse during Tyler's original trial. The timing felt symbolic somehow, as if the changing seasons reflected the possibility of transformation and renewal that had brought them to this moment. Mary Patterson accompanied them for moral support, her friendship with Sarah having deepened through the years of recovery and healing. Mary had witnessed Sarah's worst moments of pain and despair, but she'd also seen her friend's remarkable resilience and determination to rebuild her life around something more meaningful than victimhood. Sarah's decision to become an advocate for domestic violence prevention had transformed her trauma into purpose, giving her a platform to help others while processing her own experience. The correctional facility loomed gray and forbidding against the Montana landscape, its walls and guard towers serving as stark reminders of the price Tyler had paid for his moment of violence. Sarah felt her heart racing as they approached the visitor entrance, despite months of preparation for this encounter. The last time she'd seen Tyler had been during his sentencing hearing, when he'd appeared broken and remorseful, but still recognizably the angry young man who had tried to kill her. Security procedures required surrendering personal belongings and submitting to searches that emphasized the controlled environment they were entering, where normal social interactions were mediated by rules designed to protect both visitors and inmates from unpredictable behavior. Sarah found herself studying the faces of other families waiting for their own hearings, wondering about the crimes and circumstances that had brought them to this institutional setting where hope and disappointment were measured in years rather than moments. The hearing room was smaller than Sarah had expected, containing only a long table where 3 parole board members sat with folders containing Tyler's complete criminal and institutional record. Tyler entered wearing prison-issued clothing that hung loosely on his frame, his appearance dramatically different from the bulky teenager who had attacked her 5 years earlier. He was taller and leaner, his face bearing the mature features of a man who had been forced to confront fundamental questions about his character and values. His eyes met Sarah's briefly before he took his seat across from the parole board, and in that moment she saw neither the angry boy who had grabbed the kerosene lamp nor the broken young man who had been sentenced for his crimes. Instead, she recognized someone who had traveled a difficult journey toward understanding and accountability, though the depth of his transformation remained to be tested through his words and behavior during the hearing. Board Chairman Michael Rodriguez opened the proceedings by reviewing Tyler's institutional record, noting his participation in educational programs, his clean disciplinary history, and the psychological evaluations that documented his progress in addressing the mental health issues that had contributed to his criminal behavior. Tyler listened without interruption, his posture respectful and attentive in a way that contrasted sharply with the defiant teenager who had sat through his original trial. When invited to speak on his own behalf, Tyler's statement was carefully prepared but delivered with apparent sincerity as he described his understanding of the harm he'd caused and his plans for avoiding similar problems in the future. He acknowledged that his actions had been inexcusable regardless of his psychological state, accepted full responsibility for choosing violence instead of seeking help, and expressed genuine remorse for the suffering he'd inflicted on people who had tried to support him through his grief. His description of the attack was unflinching in its honesty, demonstrating that he understood exactly what he'd done and why his behavior had been criminal rather than simply unfortunate. Tyler spoke about watching Sarah writhe in flames, hearing her screams, and realizing that his anger had transformed him into someone capable of attempted murder. The memory still caused him visible distress, but he didn't try to minimize or rationalize his actions in ways that might suggest he hadn't truly accepted responsibility. Sarah's victim impact statement was the emotional centerpiece of the hearing, her scarred face serving as visual evidence of Tyler's crimes while her words demonstrated the remarkable journey she'd traveled from victim to survivor to advocate. She described not only her physical injuries and ongoing medical needs, but the psychological trauma that had required years of therapy to address, and the ways Tyler's violence had affected her relationship with Robert and her sense of safety in the world. But Sarah's statement also included something the parole board rarely heard from victims of violent crime: a genuine expression of forgiveness and hope for Tyler's successful rehabilitation. She spoke about receiving his letters over the years, watching his transformation through his writing, and coming to believe that people could change fundamentally if they were willing to do the difficult work of confronting their problems honestly and completely. Her forgiveness wasn't naive or sentimental, she emphasized, but rather a recognition that Tyler had become someone different from the person who had attacked her, and that keeping him imprisoned indefinitely would serve no useful purpose if he had genuinely learned to manage his psychological problems constructively. Sarah's statement surprised even the experienced parole board members, who were accustomed to victims demanding maximum punishment rather than advocating for their attacker's release. Robert's statement was briefer but equally powerful, describing the destruction of his family and his own struggle to understand how he'd failed to recognize his son's dangerous mental state before it exploded into violence. He spoke about the guilt that had consumed him for years, wondering whether different parenting decisions might have prevented the tragedy, and his eventual acceptance that Tyler's choices had been his own responsibility regardless of family dynamics or psychological problems. Like Sarah, Robert expressed cautious support for Tyler's parole, based on their correspondence and his belief that his son had undergone genuine transformation during his incarceration. The letters had revealed not only Tyler's remorse but his developing understanding of mental health issues and his plans for continuing therapy and education if released. Robert's support came with conditions, including Tyler's agreement to have no direct contact with Sarah without her explicit consent and his commitment to ongoing psychological treatment. Dr. Walsh's professional assessment provided the clinical foundation for the parole board's decision, documenting Tyler's progress through various therapeutic programs and his demonstrated ability to recognize triggers that had previously led to violent behavior. Her evaluation indicated that Tyler's risk of reoffending was low, particularly given his age, his lack of prior criminal history, and his successful adaptation to prison life over 5 years. The psychological testing revealed someone who had developed effective coping strategies for managing anger and depression, though Dr. Walsh emphasized that his ultimate success would depend on his ability to maintain these skills under the stress of reintegration into civilian life. Her recommendation for parole included requirements for continued therapy, regular check-ins with mental health professionals, and gradual transition through a halfway house program designed to ease the adjustment to freedom. Prison officials testified about Tyler's behavior during incarceration, describing him as a model inmate who had mentored younger prisoners struggling with similar issues and participated actively in programs designed to prevent recidivism. His work assignments had been completed responsibly, his interactions with staff and other inmates had been appropriate, and his educational achievements suggested genuine commitment to self-improvement, rather than simply serving time until release. The parole board deliberated for nearly 2 hours before returning with their decision, a length of time that suggested serious consideration of all factors rather than a predetermined outcome, based solely on the severity of Tyler's original crimes. Chairman Rodriguez announced that parole would be granted contingent on Tyler's acceptance of specific conditions, designed to ensure public safety and support his continued rehabilitation. The conditions included mandatory residence in a supervised halfway house for 6 months, regular meetings with a parole officer, continued psychological counseling, community service focused on domestic violence prevention, and absolute prohibition of contact with Sarah without her written consent. Tyler would also be required to maintain steady employment and abstain completely from alcohol, with random testing to ensure compliance. Tyler's acceptance of these conditions was immediate and unqualified, his relief at the prospect of release balanced by obvious understanding that parole represented the beginning rather than the end of his journey toward full rehabilitation. The halfway house would provide structure and supervision while allowing him to gradually adjust to freedom, and the community service requirement would give him opportunities to contribute positively to society while processing his own experience. Sarah felt a complex mixture of emotions as the hearing concluded, and Tyler was led back to his cell to begin preparations for release within 30 days. Her forgiveness had been genuine, but seeing him again had stirred memories and fears that she'd thought were fully resolved through therapy. The scarred woman who left the correctional facility was the same person who had entered, but the experience had marked another milestone in her ongoing journey of healing and growth. Robert drove home in thoughtful silence, processing his own feelings about his son's impending release and the complex family dynamics that would need to be navigated carefully to avoid triggering new conflicts. Tyler would not be returning to Cedar Falls initially, but eventually some form of relationship would need to be established if they were to function as any kind of family unit, despite the crimes that had nearly destroyed them all. Jake Thompson learned of Tyler's parole approval through Frank Morrison, who remained the unofficial clearinghouse for community news despite the passage of years. Jake's reaction was characteristically understated, expressing hope that Tyler had genuinely learned from his experience, while acknowledging that only time would reveal whether his rehabilitation was authentic or simply another performance designed to achieve freedom. The rancher who had witnessed Tyler's attack and testified at his trial felt no particular satisfaction or concern about the parole decision, recognizing that his role in the case had ended with his courtroom testimony years earlier. Tyler's future was now his own responsibility, just as Jake's intervention had been his own choice when confronted with someone else's desperate need for help. Tyler's release 30 days later was conducted quietly, without media attention or community fanfare, allowing him to begin his supervised transition back to civilian life without the complications that would have accompanied public scrutiny. The halfway house in Billings provided structure and support while giving him opportunities to demonstrate his ability to function responsibly in society after 5 years of institutional living. His first job was washing dishes at a restaurant near the halfway house, humble work that provided both income and the satisfaction of contributing productively to society rather than consuming resources as a burden on the correctional system. Tyler approached these responsibilities with dedication that impressed his supervisors, understanding that every aspect of his behavior would be evaluated as evidence of his rehabilitation's authenticity. The community service requirement introduced Tyler to domestic violence prevention organizations that had used his case as an example of how quickly family tensions could escalate into life-threatening violence. Working with these groups forced him to confront the broader implications of his actions while providing opportunities to help others avoid the mistakes that had cost him years of freedom and nearly cost Sarah her life. Sarah continued her advocacy work with these same organizations, though careful coordination ensured that she and Tyler never encountered each other during their volunteer activities. Her speeches to law enforcement officers, medical professionals, and community groups had helped countless people recognize warning signs of domestic violence while emphasizing the importance of intervention before situations reached crisis points. The letters between Tyler and his family continued throughout his first year of parole, documenting his progress toward full independence while maintaining the emotional connections that would be crucial to his long-term success. Sarah's correspondence remained supportive but boundaried, offering encouragement for his rehabilitation while protecting her own emotional well-being through careful limits on their interaction. Robert's relationship with Tyler gradually evolved from the formal exchanges of early parole to more natural father-son communication as months passed without incident, and Tyler demonstrated consistent responsibility in meeting his obligations. The possibility of eventual face-to-face meetings was discussed cautiously, with all parties understanding that such encounters would require careful preparation and ongoing therapeutic support. 2 years after his release, Tyler completed his parole requirements successfully and achieved full freedom. For the first time since his attack on Sarah, his transition to independent living was managed carefully, with continued counseling and support systems designed to help him navigate The challenges of building a normal life while carrying the permanent consequences of his criminal record. His employment had progressed from dishwashing to restaurant management, and he had completed an associate degree in psychology through night school programs that accommodated his work schedule. Tyler's long-term goal remained working in mental health or social services, fields where his personal experience with violence and rehabilitation might provide valuable perspective for helping others avoid similar tragedies. Sarah's own journey continued to evolve as her physical recovery reached its limits and her focus shifted increasingly toward advocacy and prevention work. The scarring that marked her as a survivor had become less prominent over time, but it remained a visible reminder of how quickly domestic violence could explode into life-threatening assault even in families that appeared normal to outside observers. Her marriage to Robert had not only survived Tyler's attack, but had deepened through their shared experience of trauma and recovery, though both understood that their relationship would always be shaped by the violence that had occurred in their kitchen that terrible morning. They had learned to find joy and purpose despite their scars, building a life together that honored both the suffering they'd endured and the love that had sustained them through their darkest periods. Jake Thompson remained on his ranch, his involvement in the Bennett family tragedy having become just one chapter in a life dedicated to the quiet pursuit of purpose and meaning in rural Montana. The horses that had provided comfort during his own grief continued to anchor his days, their presence offering stability and companionship that required nothing more than daily care and attention. The story of Tyler's attack on Sarah and Jake's intervention had become part of Cedar Falls' collective memory, told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy as new residents learned about the community's history and long-time residents processed their own roles in the tragedy. The house on Maple Street had been renovated and sold multiple times, its connection to the violence gradually fading as new families created their own memories within its walls. Cedar Falls itself had implemented new programs for identifying and addressing domestic violence with training for teachers, medical professionals, and law enforcement designed to recognize warning signs before family tensions escalated into criminal behavior. Tyler's case had become a cautionary tale that influenced policy and practice, giving meaning to the suffering while helping prevent similar tragedies in other families. The transformation of all three principal figures in the story continued years after the attack, with each finding ways to build meaningful lives despite the permanent changes that violence had wrought in their relationships and circumstances. Sarah's scars told a story of survival and resilience. Tyler's rehabilitation demonstrated the possibility of redemption even after terrible crimes, and Jake's intervention proved that individual courage could make the difference between tragedy and survival. The silent rancher who had witnessed a woman burning and acted to save her life returned to the solitude he'd always preferred, his brief moment of public attention having confirmed his belief that heroism was simply doing what needed to be done. When confronted with someone else's desperate need, the horses that had carried him past the Bennett house that morning continued their daily routines, unaware that their presence had provided the transportation necessary for one man's act of moral courage to change 3 lives forever. 10 years had transformed Cedar Falls from a town haunted by one family's tragedy into a community that had learned to embrace both accountability and redemption, with the Bennett case serving as a turning point that influenced how residents approached mental health, domestic violence, and their responsibility to each other. The Mountain View Diner still buzzed with conversation each morning, but the discussions now included regular updates about new counseling programs at the high school, domestic violence awareness seminars at St. Mark's Community Church, and the success stories of families who had received early intervention before their problems escalated into violence. Sarah Mitchell stood before a packed auditorium at the University of Montana, her presentation on domestic violence prevention drawing an audience of future social workers, law enforcement officers, and medical professionals who would carry her message into communities across the state. The scars on her face had become her credentials rather than her shame. Visible proof that survival was possible, even after the most brutal attacks, and that victims could transform their trauma into purpose if given proper support and encouragement. Her voice, still bearing the husky quality that smoke damage had left behind, carried clearly through the lecture hall as she described the morning when her stepson's rage had exploded into attempted murder. The students listened with rapt attention, many taking notes about warning signs they should recognize and intervention strategies that might prevent similar tragedies in their own professional practices. The presentation included photographs of her injuries that still caused audible gasps from audiences, but Sarah no longer flinched when displaying these images because they served a vital educational purpose. Medical students needed to understand the devastating consequences of thermal injuries. Law enforcement trainees required visual evidence of domestic violence's potential severity, and social work candidates had to confront the reality that family dysfunction could explode into life-threatening assault without warning. Her marriage to Robert had evolved into something deeper and more purposeful than their initial relationship, forged through shared trauma, but sustained by mutual commitment to helping others avoid their experience. They had become a team in ways that transcended traditional husband-wife roles, working together on advocacy projects that honored their suffering while building something meaningful from the ashes of their family's destruction. Robert had taken early retirement from the lumber mill to manage the nonprofit organization they had established in memory of his first wife, whose death had triggered Tyler's psychological decline and eventual violence. The Helen Bennett Foundation provided funding for mental health services in rural communities, grief counseling for adolescents who had lost parents, and emergency assistance for domestic violence victims who needed immediate escape from dangerous situations. Tyler Bennett walked across the stage at Montana State University to receive his bachelor's degree in social work, his academic achievements representing a decade of determined effort to rebuild his life around service rather than destruction. The young man who had once tried to kill his stepmother in a moment of rage had transformed into someone whose personal experience with violence and rehabilitation gave him unique insight into helping others navigate similar challenges. His graduation was attended by Sarah and Robert, their presence in the audience representing a level of forgiveness and family reconciliation that few people could comprehend or achieve. The journey toward this moment had required years of therapy, countless difficult conversations, and a willingness by all parties to believe that people could change fundamentally if they committed themselves completely to personal growth and accountability. Tyler's first job after graduation was with a residential treatment facility for adolescents struggling with anger management, substance abuse, and family conflicts that threatened to explode into violence. His supervisors had been initially skeptical about hiring someone with his criminal background, but his academic record, professional references, and obvious commitment to rehabilitation had convinced them that his personal experience could be valuable in reaching troubled teenagers who had lost hope in their ability to change. The young people he worked with responded to his authenticity in ways that surprised even Tyler himself, recognizing that his understanding of their problems came from lived experience rather than textbook knowledge. His story became a powerful tool for breaking through the defenses that angry adolescents constructed to protect themselves from adults who claimed to understand their pain but had never experienced anything comparable. Jake Thompson maintained his morning routine of riding through the countryside surrounding his ranch, though his route now occasionally took him past the former Bennett property, where new owners had created a thriving organic farm that supplied restaurants throughout the region. The kitchen window where he had witnessed Tyler's attack had been replaced multiple times over the years, erasing the last physical evidence of the violence while allowing the property to serve productive purposes, rather than remaining a monument to tragedy. His role as the key witness in Tyler's prosecution had long since faded from public memory, leaving him free to return to the anonymity he had always preferred. The horses that had carried him past the Bennett house that fateful morning were now older, some retired to peaceful pasture living, while younger animals had joined the herd to continue the cycles of birth, growth, and renewal that marked ranch life. The letters from strangers praising his heroism had stopped arriving years ago, replaced by the occasional academic researcher studying bystander intervention or journalist, writing retrospective pieces about domestic violence cases that had influenced public policy. Jake declined these requests politely but firmly, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves, rather than becoming a spokesperson for causes that others could advocate more effectively. His relationship with Catherine's memory had evolved from acute grief to gentle remembrance, with their shared years together becoming a source of strength rather than overwhelming sadness. The guilt over his inability to save her from the car accident had been tempered by his successful intervention in Sarah's case, creating a sense of balance that allowed him to honor both experiences without being consumed by either. Dr. Amanda Foster had published research papers about Sarah's recovery that became influential in trauma therapy circles, documenting how victims of severe violence could not only survive their experiences but transform them into sources of strength and purpose. Sarah's case had become a textbook example of post-traumatic growth, demonstrating that some people could emerge from terrible experiences with enhanced resilience, deeper relationships, and clearer life purpose. The therapy techniques that had proven effective in Sarah's treatment were now being used with other victims of domestic violence, burn injuries, and traumatic assault. Her willingness to participate in follow-up studies and speak candidly about her recovery process had contributed to advances in treatment protocols that would benefit countless future victims who needed evidence that healing was possible even after the most severe trauma. Cedar Falls High School had implemented mandatory counseling services and conflict resolution programs that had dramatically reduced incidents of student violence and family dysfunction among teenagers in the district. Tyler's case had convinced school board members and community leaders that early intervention was far more effective and less costly than dealing with the consequences of untreated mental health problems and family conflicts. Linda Chun, the guidance counselor who had failed to recognize the severity of Tyler's problems before his attack on Sarah, had become a passionate advocate for expanded mental health services in schools. Her guilt over missing warning signs had motivated her to pursue additional training in adolescent psychology and family therapy, transforming her personal failure into professional expertise that helped her identify and assist other troubled students before their problems escalated into violence. The programs she had developed were now being replicated in school districts throughout Montana, providing early identification and intervention for students struggling with grief, anger, substance abuse, and family dysfunction. Tyler's story was used in training materials for educators, emphasizing the importance of recognizing behavioral changes that might indicate psychological distress requiring professional intervention. Mary Patterson had been promoted to head nurse at Cedar Falls Medical Clinic, her friendship with Sarah having deepened her understanding of trauma recovery and patient advocacy. The clinic now offered specialized services for domestic violence victims, including coordinated medical care, counseling referrals, and safety planning that addressed both immediate injuries and long-term healing needs. Her professional development had been influenced profoundly by witnessing Sarah's journey from victim to survivor to advocate, demonstrating how medical professionals could support patients through comprehensive care that addressed psychological as well as physical injuries. The protocols she had helped develop were being adopted by rural healthcare facilities throughout the region. Frank Morrison's hardware store continued serving as an unofficial community gathering place, but the conversations now included regular discussions about mental health awareness, domestic violence prevention, and the importance of community members looking out for each other rather than avoiding involvement in family problems. Tyler's case had convinced longtime residents that minding their own business could sometimes enable tragedies that might have been prevented through earlier intervention. The store displayed literature about counseling services, support groups, and crisis hotlines alongside the usual advertisements for farm equipment and home improvement supplies. Frank had become an unlikely advocate for community involvement in identifying and addressing family dysfunction before it escalated into violence. Pastor Jim Walsh had expanded St. Mark's Community Church programming to include support groups for families dealing with grief, substance abuse, and domestic conflict, recognizing that spiritual guidance needed to be supplemented with practical resources for people struggling with complex psychological and social problems. Tyler's attack on Sarah had forced him to confront the limitations of prayer and fellowship in addressing serious mental health issues. The church now hosted monthly seminars on topics ranging from adolescent grief counseling to recognizing signs of domestic violence, with guest speakers including mental health professionals, law enforcement officers, and survivors who could speak from personal experience about recovery and healing. These programs had become popular throughout the community, attracting participants from various religious backgrounds who appreciated the practical focus on problem solving rather than simply offering spiritual comfort. Tyler's relationship with his father had gradually restored itself through years of careful rebuilding, honest communication, and shared commitment to honoring the memory of Tyler's mother while accepting responsibility for the violence that had nearly destroyed their family. Robert's ability to forgive his son while maintaining appropriate boundaries had required extensive therapy and spiritual counseling, but the result was a father-son relationship that was deeper and more authentic than their previous connection. Their monthly meetings continued even after Tyler's successful completion of parole, providing opportunities for honest conversation about their shared past and individual futures. Robert had come to understand that his son's violence had resulted from a complex combination of untreated grief, adolescent brain development, and family dynamics that no single person could have controlled or predicted. Sarah's advocacy work had expanded beyond domestic violence prevention to include burn injury recovery, mental health awareness, and victim rights legislation that improved services for people navigating the criminal justice system. Her testimony before state legislative committees had influenced passage of laws requiring better coordination between medical, legal, and social service systems serving crime victims. The foundation she and Robert had established now operated programs in 12 rural Montana communities, providing services that ranged from emergency financial assistance for families in crisis to long-term counseling for adolescents struggling with parental loss. Their work had prevented numerous potential tragedies by identifying and addressing family dysfunction before it escalated into violence. The 10th anniversary of Tyler's attack brought media attention that Sarah and Robert handled with practiced grace, using interviews and speaking opportunities to emphasize prevention, rather than sensationalizing the violence that had changed their lives. Tyler declined most interview requests, preferring to let his professional work speak for his rehabilitation rather than becoming a public figure defined by his worst moment. Jake Thompson learned about the anniversary through local news coverage that briefly revisited the case, but his involvement was mentioned only in passing as reporters focused on Sarah's recovery and Tyler's redemption rather than the intervention that had saved her life. His preference for privacy was respected by journalists who understood that some heroes valued anonymity more than recognition. The rancher who had witnessed a woman burning and acted to save her continued his quiet life among the horses and cattle that had always provided him with purpose and peace. His morning rides revealed the changing seasons and natural cycles that persisted regardless of human drama, reminding him that individual actions mattered deeply but were ultimately part of larger patterns of growth, decline, and renewal. Cedar Falls had become a model community for addressing domestic violence and mental health issues proactively rather than reactively, with the Bennett case serving as the catalyst for changes that had benefited countless families over the decade. Since Tyler's attack on Sarah, the tragedy that had once divided the town had ultimately brought residents together around shared commitment to protecting vulnerable community members and supporting families in crisis. The silent rancher whose quick thinking and moral courage had prevented one tragedy from becoming far worse returned to his preferred anonymity, satisfied that his moment of heroism had contributed to positive changes that extended far beyond the immediate crisis he had witnessed through a kitchen window one frost-covered morning. His horses carried him through landscapes that held memories of violence and redemption, survival and transformation, proving that ordinary people could make extraordinary differences when confronted with someone else's desperate need for help. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.